What do people know about eating disorders? What indicates an eating disorder? What are the complications of eating disorders? And are there links between eating disorders and mental health? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Musam Tombene, and signing with us today is Ndlovu. On Vital Signs, we will focus on eating disorders. Eating disorders are often seen as a lifestyle choice, but they're serious illnesses that have severe impact on a person's health and everyday life and can often be fatal. Common eating disorders include anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating. And coming up on the program, we'll hear from a woman who's diagnosed with bulimia. She shares her journey with us. We'll speak to a clinical psychologist as well as a dietitian about these common eating disorders, the treatment, rehabilitation, and support. Remember that you can be part of the show by asking the guests that we'll have on any question that you'll have on your mind by simply sharing your view on what we're discussing. The number to call is 011-714-0677 or 011-714-0678. Of course, we're available on social media on Twitter at SABC Vital Signs or Facebook SABC Vital Signs. The show continues after this break. Stay with us.
Who's our guest?
Position that quick. Check for me.
Yeah, but now what is that there? Now, what's going on there? Where? Do you want us to a couch or what?
Yeah. Ma'am, you go sit there. Right? The sofa goes in there. So he does this interview, then he will walk across to there.
In one segment.
Yeah, in one segment.
Hi, how are you? Very well, thank you. Morong one, eh?
Yes.
Shut. Monko.
Yeah.
Cool.
Let's try to not.
Welcome back to Vital Signs. Now, eating disorders can be described as illnesses that are characterized by destructive eating habits and severe distress or concern about body weight or shape. Now, eating disorders do not discriminate. They are complex mental health disorders that can affect anyone, regardless of age, sex, race, and are influenced by many factors. Although the exact cause of eating disorders is unknown, it is generally believed that they're a combination of biological, psychological, environmental, and many other factors that contribute to the development of these illnesses. Now, before we delve deeper into what these disorders are about, let's talk mind and body transformation with our transformation coach, Morongwa Monko, about her journey with bulimia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good. So, a lot of people speak to this idea of a food journey. A lot of people really perceive and look at food as the stuff you put in your mouth. Sometimes it's nice when you buy it out. Sometimes it's just boiled chicken and life continues. But tell us about your food journey.
Oh, so my food journey was a bit complex. So growing up, it was fine. Early primary school, I think now looking back, I can see the signs that it started getting toxic then. But high school was fine. Then varsity happened. Varsity happened and food became a coping mechanism. It wasn't just about eating or just buying food. It became, if I don't eat, I can't breathe. If I don't finish what I cooked today, I can't breathe. But even though that was happening in varsity, I couldn't afford that lifestyle because I was studying with NSFAS. So it was a bit controlled until I started working. At that point, my relationship with food became something completely different, something that I couldn't control. Being a disciplined person, I thought even if I was living on my own, I can control my relationship with food. But at that point, I couldn't because, it had taken over my entire life. It became something that was outside of me.
Now, you speak about food in a different way to what I would speak about food. Because, you speak about control, you speak about the signs that you saw when you're younger. So let's speak about this primary school period where you look back now and you see the signs. What were the things that you looked for that made the relationship that you had with food a little bit abnormal?
So when I was younger, there's a relative that I used to visit. So I pick up now that when I was home, I ate normally. I was a normal child. Home was a safe space. But every time I visited this relative, I'd be binging. I'd be, when people are sleeping, I'd be going into the kitchen, eating a lot. Now that I look back, I know what triggered it, but then I just thought it's because endlessly these things are not there, but here they are.
That's such an important thing that you raise, is that a lot of the time, looking at the socioeconomic of the country, status of the country, where people are and things such as that, food doesn't necessarily become that very standard thing that you expect to find in each and every home. That when you do go out to a restaurant, people feel the need to want to finish their food and consume as much as they can. And this raised flags for you when you look back. But let's talk about this varsity period where you start seeing this behavior becoming more compulsive on your end. Let's speak about that period in your life.
You know, in that time, what I picked up was that, so the main thing that was happening at that point was that if I was to cook something, I couldn't go to bed until the pot was empty.
Sure.
So I'd be in my bedroom, but I'd be thinking, I need to go back to the kitchen. I need to go back to the kitchen until the pot was empty. Then I could sleep. And I could see that, no, this right here is not, it's not me and it's not right, because it's almost as if, like I said, it's something that's happening outside of me and I have no control over it.
Sure.
But also, around that time, that's when a lot of things that happened in my childhood was coming to the surface.
Okay.
And I didn't have any other support at that time but the food. Yeah.
So you get to a point where you finish varsity, you start working, and you say it explodes. Let's talk about that.
Musa, yeah, you know what? I'll take you back to this one day. So I used to take a taxi at Bree. So coming home, the taxi would pass my house, and then like a few stops ahead would be Pick and Pay. And I'd always be thinking to myself, today I'm going to get off Guam and I'm going home. But every single day without fail, I couldn't. I'd drive, I'd go with the taxi, get off at the store, buy like a loaf of bread, donuts, like I'd buy a lot of food, then walk back home, eat all of that. And then after that, it felt like I would not be able to sleep until I ate pizza. After eating all of that, I'd still call a scooter and and this was happening every night, where it was so bad that after eating, I couldn't breathe, but I still felt like I still need to do this. I had no control.
So you find yourself having walked back from the shop, you are basically putting so much food into your mouth because this is what this thing requires from you. You get home, you order more food, and then what happens?
So what would happen is, because I'm so full, I'll probably have like 60% of it and put the rest of the pizza in the fridge. But I can't sleep until I finish it.
Sure.
So I'm in bed, the lights are off. I can't breathe because of how full I am. But it feels like this thing is saying, you have to eat me now. We're not sleeping until this box is completely empty. And I'd wake up around 10, 11 and go back into, open the fridge and eat the rest of it, even though I was as stuffed as I would have been.
So you get the diagnosis at this point in time. What triggers you to go get help and get this diagnosis?
So here's the thing with me. I actually never got formally diagnosed. I was in therapy for 3 years in varsity. Now that I look back, I actually never told my therapist that this was happening. I knew it was a problem. When we were in therapy, she'd tell me that people that grew up the way you grew up end up having 1, 2, 3, 4. But I wouldn't tell her that one of these things that you are mentioning is something that I'm currently living with. What made me get to a point where I realized that, no, this is a problem, is how frequent it was happening, how much I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was dying every night, but I still felt like I needed to do it. And also now it was taking over my day, because even at work, I'd get to work, eat breakfast with my colleague normally, and then I'd go downstairs because we had a canteen downstairs. Then I'd eat away from my colleagues so that they don't see that I'm having a second portion, even though we just ate 5 minutes ago. And then after that, I'd buy snacks on top of that and walk back upstairs as if, no, this is the only thing I was buying. And that's when I realized that something not right.
So you go on this healing journey. You are now someone that goes out and looks to help people. You speak about mind and body transformation. Tell us more about that.
So in 2018, so I've always been into fitness. My father is great into fitness. I mean, the first time I used an app while I was like 6, 7.
Sure.
So I've always been into fitness. So 2017, 2018, I decided I'm going to do a personal training course. But I realized that I myself can't preach the things that the textbooks are saying because I'm not living them, right? And I started realizing that with me, I could trace back to when I started having body image issues and when I started gaining weight and why I can't lose it. And when I started helping people, if I still do that now. Unfortunately, you can tell people the truth. They decide to take it or not. I always say to people, trace back to when you started gaining weight, then I can help you to lose weight. Because if we're going to start here where we're at, it's not going to work. If you have an addiction to cake, if you have an addiction to sweets, if you're eating late at night and you can't stop yourself, we need to figure out why exactly you're at this point and then try and get you maybe a psychologist to help, but we can't just start in the middle.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Morongwa. I think it was highly important to have you on. I think that personal experience, that personal touch that you've given us today will make a lot of people take a step back and look at where their journeys with food started and where they currently are and where they could potentially go. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue our discussion. Of course, like I said, we've got a clinical psychologist as well as a dietitian joining us today, and they are here to chat to us. Good day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good. So, charity. It's an interesting discussion that we're having today, this idea of eating disorders, where a lot of people don't see food as a problem, you know? You think food is there to sustain me, and I'm allowed to, you know, treat myself from time to time. So let's speak about eating disorders. What and how do we classify eating disorders?
I mean, like you say, food seems like a very benign and very simple thing that most people, when you're sad, you eat, when you celebrate, you eat, when you just feeling neutral, you eat. So it's something that feels quite simplistic and something that a lot of people don't give thought to. But I think what's very important is to consider and bear in mind the connection between the mind and the body. And that's where the psychological perspective of food and how people see and perceive food and how people use food becomes quite important. So when we're looking at eating disorders and disordered feeding and eating, that's what it's called, we think about the connection of the psychological well-being or psychological state that someone is in and how they use food. Okay, so people use food in different ways, and I think from what you heard from the guest and her story about how it is, and I think the most important thing then for something to be classified as an eating disorder or feeding and eating disorder is when the person is using food to curb some sort of an emotional state or something that has happened either in their childhood or quite a difficult emotional or affective state that they find themselves in.
Is that easy? Is that easy to identify? So if I'm having a bad day, I've had a bad day at work and I drive home and I feel like, you know what, I feel like a glass of wine. I also feel like ordering in a pizza and just taking it easy because I'm not feeling that great. I don't feel like cooking. Is that a disordered eating pattern, or are there many other things that need to tick boxes for me to be classified as someone that has an eating disorder?
Okay. So for something to be classified as a disorder, it needs to be maladaptive. So what that means is that it comes in the way of your everyday functioning and your optimal functioning. So for instance, having a bad day and eating a tub of ice cream every now and then, if it's not impacting on your functioning, that is causing you harm, either in terms of your physical health or getting full to a point where you can't breathe or can't sleep, that is when something is maladaptive. So it comes in the way of your functioning or your optimal functioning, either in your work or even with your physical health. So that is when it will be classified as an eating disorder. And so when we think about and when we diagnose eating disorders, it is something we do with a lot of caution. And what we do more than anything else is check whether or not this behavior or how this person uses food has become disruptive to their life. So in most cases with eating disorders, we work in a multidisciplinary team, so with dietitians, with medical doctors, to be able to check on the physical side of things. So physically, it takes a toll on the person's body because it's something that they need to do over a prolonged period of time and something that they need to do excessively, either the purging, the throwing up if it's bulimia, or really restricting food in the case of anorexia and overeating in the case of obesity. So it is about how the behaviors and how the ways in which this person uses food has become maladaptive. That is, it becomes very disruptive to their everyday functioning and really comes in the way of activities of daily living.
Now, someone that would agree that eating and food in general is very important is Matome. Matome, thank you so much for joining us once again. This idea of nutrition is an important one because it lives in the everyday food that we'll eat. Every single time you walk past a shop and a whiff of that chicken hits you, you think, do I really want that piece of chicken or should I go home to the salad that I planned on eating? So when it comes to eating disorders, what are the big things that you look for in terms of nutritional status of the people that come to see you?
Good morning, Mosa, and good morning to the viewers at home. Look, food plays a very important role in our everyday. When somebody comes to my office and say, I've got an eating disorder, one of the things that we do is check your weight, your height, we'll check your upper arm circumference, just to check whether your weight is according to the age and height where you're supposed to be at. And also we look at your dietary intake. How much food are you taking on a daily basis? So that we can meet your daily requirements for any activity that you have to take on a daily basis. That somehow will give us a picture of whether this person is eating enough or not eating enough.
Now, this idea of eating enough and not eating enough, I think, is quite a relative one in the sense that, when patients come in and we do histories and interview them and things such as that, we'll always ask about weight loss, if it's intentional or unintentional, right? And if you find yourself at a point where you feel that you are big, so if I'm an 80-kilogram man and I feel like I've gained too much weight and I want to lose weight, and I describe to you a nutritional pattern that is less than what you would desire, how do we manage and make sure that I don't accelerate this process of wanting to lose weight, in inverted commas, to a point where it's pathological?
Look, one of the things we do, when you take your height, your weight, you look at what you call BMI. That's your weight relative to your height. Your normal BMI will be between 18 and 25. So looking at what the person eats, meaning eating enough or not eating enough, gives you an indication of how much this person is supposed to be eating. And you go back and look at, this is your BMI. This is your maximum weight that you can be at. More than that, you're overweight. And if you are going to lose weight more than that, understand that you're also going to be underweight. And there's both repercussions of being underweight and being overweight.
Now, this idea of eating disorders is an important one, but how prevalent is it in our society? I think when you think eating disorders, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of us are those American movies with a skinny girl who goes to the bathroom after every meal, and we say that's that. And that won't necessarily fit the picture of what we'd imagine that to be in South Africa. So how prevalent is this?
Absolutely. I think the prevalence rates in South Africa are really understated because a lot of people don't present with some of the symptoms that they have. Because food has been such a normalized element, and like you're saying, in the South African context, given the very unequal socioeconomic status that people find themselves in and the ways in which people have been told to think about food, it becomes very difficult then for them to present to a professional and actually flag some of their eating and feeding behaviors that might be problematic or that might lend to being an eating disorder. So the prevalence is definitely understated in the South African context, particularly amongst Black young people and Black youth, because of the ways in which, particularly if they're from a lower socioeconomic status, food is viewed. So it is something that is a scarce resource for them and something that is quite important when you get it. So there isn't as much exposure to some of the languaging and some of even the red flags that people should look out for when there's eating. And I think a big one, which is seems like more of an epidemic in the South African context, is overeating. So if you look at the patterns of lifestyle diseases that people have and the rates of obesity in the country, it lends itself at times to show that some people usually use food as a way of self-soothing and comfort, particularly if there's been quite a high rate of childhood trauma in someone's history in the way in which they use food. So the prevalence is definitely underreported and understated because of the ways in which people think about and view food. But I think that if you look at the picture clinically and people were to report, we'd have more cases of obesity, particularly around the Black population, as opposed to what you would typically see in these teenage American movies.
Now, psychologically, culture plays a big role in all of this. And Matome, this question is coming to you. This idea, and I know it personally, when I go home and my mommy sees me the way that I look right now, she's very happy because she sees mkaba. She says, I'm eating nice, I'm living good. But naturally, I think we all know that that does not necessarily mean that I'm healthy. So, in the context of what Charity has said to us with respect to, obesity being such a big problem in our country, what does the normal person that comes to you and plans on losing weight because they're above that 25 mark on your BMI and says they want to lose weight, what do they describe as their everyday meal, or how has that looked?
Most of the time, remember, people eat just because food is available. The everyday meal, wake up in the morning, people wake up with Multidisciplinary on the street as they're going to work. People have high-fat meals in the morning. On your English breakfast, people will be having 4 or 5 slices of food, of bread in the morning. Your lunchtime, most of the time, people generally have takeaways. It can either be your traditional takeaways or literally just a woman on the street that is cooking. That's basically what they have. And the amount of food that most people have, people literally eat to have food in their stomach, not necessarily that they want at least to say this is the amount of eaten that I'm enough. You go in the evening, again, we are frying our food. Hardly you ever get people in the office that say, I grill my food, I mostly just boil my food or remove all the excess fat. Mostly we like food that is fatty because it tastes very nice. That's generally that. Hardly ever people have fruits. Even vegetables, far in between. Most of the time we want our several colors on Sunday, but from Monday to Friday or even Saturday, hardly people have vegetables on their meal. Most of the time, it's a huge chunk of starch. It can either be pap or rice or any other starch, and a whole lot of meat, and which is mostly flour.
Well, look, we continue our discussion, of course, as we go to an ad break. We're speaking to clinical psychologist Charity Mukone as well as dietitian Matome Diala about anorexia when we come back from this break. Stay with us. Sanbonani here, Vital Science. Namhlanje sikhuluma ngama-disorder wokudla. Now, anorexia has traditionally been a disease of the privileged. Now, most people believe that if you have anorexia, it means that you're obsessed with designer clothes and that you're required to be small-waisted and all those kind of things. Now, it's also believed that these are people that would shun food. After all, they were doing it because they didn't want all that food. Now, more recent research, of course, has come out to show that eating disorders are a little bit more complex than what we thought, and of course have got very little to do with vanity. Quite the opposite, actually. But in South Africa, at least, it remains an affliction of urban life. Now, we continue our discussion on this binge eating discussion, and of course, focusing on anorexia. We have our guests in studio, clinical psychologist Charity Mukone and dietitian Matome Diala. So, let's describe what anorexia nervosa is. But I want to describe it in a way that everyone at home can understand so that we're able to pick up signs from family members, brothers, sisters, and whoever else is at home when they think about that.
Okay. So anorexia is mainly about control. Okay, so if you think about it, it's about the person wanting to control the portion of food that they have, the kind of food that they have, and the amount of calories that they put on their plate and things that they consume. So a big, red flag that you see when someone has or may have anorexia nervosa is they very frantic control of what it is that they consume, how often they consume things, and also a firm belief that they have that they are overweight. So no matter what the scale says, no matter how they look, they believe that they really are overweight and that there is a necessity for them to control what they eat and really have a very tight control on the food that they consume.
Matome, is there a problem with wanting to have control over what you eat? Now, we see this a lot, for instance, as Musa, who's a gym guy who wants to control everything that's in his diet so that he knows how much protein he's taken in, how much, other stuff that he's putting into his body. So let's discuss this idea of control over diet.
I think most of the time in actual fact, you don't really see people that want to go to the gym. You literally get eating, as Chan just said, you get in these people that have this excessive desire to say, I don't want to gain weight. I don't want to be this particular way. Generally, most of the people are really, when you look at them, they look emaciated. And one of the things we literally say to them, you know, how much weight have you lost in a couple of months or so? They've lost excessive weight, but they still have this belief that they are literally overweight. So those people generally don't want to eat anything. If you're having lunch, they'll get there, I want to have a smoothie, or I just want to have a tea, some chamomile tea, I just want to have tea, and I don't want to have anything else. These guys literally don't want to have anything. Even if you have to give them a fruit, they feel the fruit is quite huge. And those people literally don't have any idea of how much they're supposed to be taking on a daily basis. Their only issue in their head is that I am overweight and I don't want to gain weight, and food is going to make me gain weight. So the less I eat, the better.
Now, the idea of these signs and symptoms that we need to look out for. What are the things that, as a parent who has a young child that you think might potentially have anorexia, what should I be on the lookout for?
I think the restricting of food, either portions, or being very careful about what you eat, and the belief that you are overweight and need to lose weight. And I also think there is something around exercise. So excessive exercise, where the person will exercise, say for half a day, 6 to 7 hours a day, and each time they eat, they gym and exercise quite rigorously in order to maintain or lose weight or try and get rid of the food that's in their system. And I think a big part of it is to track what has been happening in the person's life. And I think this is what most people miss out on. So usually after big events or big adjustments that the person has undergone, then you start to see and notice a deliberate, and I think it's very important to differentiate it from under-eating or lack of appetite that's due to depression. But this is a very intentional and very deliberate restricting of food or excessive exercise in order to stay very slim and very lean. And the goal is not to try and tell the person that they're not fat and that they're being ridiculous and that they should not stop eating, but really try and get to the underlying issue of what it is they're trying to control. So the control is shown in the food and trying to restrict and control the food, but it has a bigger narrative when you think about it psychologically. And it's not about convincing the person that they're actually not fat and they just need to eat because actually they're skin and bones, but it's about trying to understand what it is that they're trying to control. So the more that you place emphasis on the eating and the person's habits in terms of exercise or the things that they put in place to make sure that they stay lean and become thin, is the more shame the person gets, and it is what exacerbates then the symptoms of the anorexia, or them wanting to restrict more and more because they feel shamed and they feel like they're at a loss of control even more, and the more control they feel like they're losing in other things is the more control they'll try and exert in their food and eating.
Are there long-term consequences to having anorexia nervosa from a psychological perspective?
I think it's more from a physical perspective when you look at what it does to the person's body, because we're talking about very excessive restricting of food, where the person literally cannot stand to feel like they have food in their stomach. So it has dire consequences in terms of their physical health. But I think psychologically, if some of the underlying and root causes of why they feel the need to restrict their food and restrict their weight are not dealt with, then it can become a problem, because it is mainly a problem of control than it is a problem of food. So this person usually feels at a loss and really out of control of the circumstances in their environment or in their outside life, and they use food then as a mechanism of control and as a way of control. And so psychologically, it is about being able to understand what the underlying issue is, and of course in the treatment of it to use a multidisciplinary approach because of the consequences that it has on the person's body and physical well-being. So bringing in a dietitian, bringing in medical doctors, because at the point at which most people come for treatment for anorexia, it's really taken its toll on the person's body, and it needs to be characterized by the person's BMI being so low that they actually cannot do anything or perform any sort of physical activity. And so it is about stabilizing the physical effects of the disorder first before you can go into some of the underlying causes, which are mainly around control and the person feeling like there are a lot of emotions and a lot of things happening around them that they have no control over.
Matome, when it comes to treating someone with anorexia nervosa, what are the goals with respect to treating them? I'm sure it's not one of those situations where you sit them down and you say you're going to have 5,000 calories a day until we bring you back up to weight. So how do you manage a plan to get them up to an optimal weight?
Look, ideally, we would want to wake up in the morning and say, eat 5,000 kilocalories. But the ideal would be, remember, this person has not had food or proper energy and nutrition intake on a daily basis. So the ideal would be slowly and gradually move up so that you avoid what we call refeeding syndrome, when you basically have some imbalances of your potassium and sodium in your body. So the ideal would be slowly move up your calories to adjust the person up until you can get to a level when the person or the patient gains weight gradually, not literally wake up one day you are 25 kgs and then you're 75 kgs the following day.
Well, very important to hear. And of course, this continued discussion will continue as we look at this idea of eating disorders as they happen as a whole. We have a clinical psychologist, Charity Mukone, as well as dietitian Matome Diala. And after the break, we'll speak about bulimia. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vital Signs. We continue our discussion on eating disorders, and now we focus on bulimia, potentially life-threatening eating disorder, with our special guest, clinical psychologist Charity Mukone, as well as dietitian Matome Diala. So bulimia is another one that a lot of people speak about when we speak about eating disorders, and of course we're primarily focusing on three today, which would be the overeating, where a lot of people find themselves being obese and things such as that, the anorexia, which we've just discussed. What is bulimia, and how would you categorize that?
So bulimia belongs in the family of eating disorders and is closely related to anorexia. But what differs between bulimia and anorexia is that the person actually overeats. So a bulimic person will eat to, I think, a point of being in a coma, and then purge. Usually the behaviors will be purging or trying to get the food out as soon as they've eaten. So a big part of what differentiates anorexia and bulimia is that when the person overeats and when the person is eating, it's usually driven, if you look at it from a psychological perspective, by really strong emotions that the person feels like they cannot control or cannot be able to cope with. So the eating serves as a way of soothing. So they eat as a way of self-soothing each time they feel feelings of discomfort or feelings that they're not, that they feel that they wouldn't be able to cope with or handle. And then it's then followed by actions of trying to get rid of that food. So purging is one of the main things that people
Purging being
use.
vomiting, so forcing yourself to vomit.
Forcing yourself to vomit in quite drastic ways. So I've heard of people who would obviously try and put their finger to try and induce the vomit, people who would press their stomachs and go through really drastic things to try and get the food out of their system. And I think that's what makes it potentially very dangerous medically, because the purging or the vomiting the food after eating it happens very regularly. So as often as the person eats, which is quite a lot most of the time, is as often as they would try and vomit or purge or get the food out of their system. So it makes it quite a dangerous one in terms of the effects that it has on the person's body. But in terms of the causes and the way in which it plays out, so that sense of control, that sense of feeling out of control is what is characterizes bulimia, and it sort of is the same kind of presentation that you would see for anorexia, but it's just followed by the purging and the vomiting and trying to get rid of the consequences of overeating or eating excessively.
Now, Matome, someone would argue that, if I feel like I've overeaten, and I think we've all experienced that, when you had a little too many pizzas or a little too much braai food in December after Christmas, the idea that I'm just going to vomit, so there shouldn't be a physical effect on me because I've taken everything that I've put in outside. Is this a healthy way of looking at things? And then the second question is, what do people that have bulimia present as? What do they look like? Are they people that look like they weigh normally or have this normal BMI, or are these people that look more anorexic?
It can be healthy that you're going to self-induce vomiting. By the way, some people do self-induce vomiting. Some actually take laxative so that they can have diarrhea, so that all that food comes out. So the moment you do that, there's consequences. You could easily go into hypovolemic shock, where your body is just dry because all the fluids have come out of your body. You literally again put a whole strain on your stomach, because the moment you take all the food out, you're literally left with only acid in the stomach, which you end up with ulcers and everything. So that cannot be a healthy way of trying to get rid of the food if you feel like you've eaten too much. On your second question, normally these people present of normal weight to underweight, because remember their aim most of the time is literally, I am overweight, I don't want to be overweight. So most of the time you have these people that are of normal weight, almost again having those other people that are underweight. That's mostly the presentation of people that literally are obsessed with their weight and also with eating. They don't want to eat. They don't want to look like they've gained weight.
Now, you spoke to this idea of some element of control, but also trying to self-soothe by eating all the sort of food that you're putting in. Is it possible for you to have or be bulimic when you are overweight and feel like you are now eating too much, so you then start to vomit and purge and things such as that? Is it a spectrum where, you could be a skinny person and have bulimia, a middle-sized person, or a very large person that has bulimia?
It definitely is on a spectrum, and I think bulimia is one of the conditions which is quite difficult to diagnose, because, like I said, in order for it to fall in the ambit of being a disorder, it needs to be quite disruptive to the person's life. So people will normally have maybe dips in their mood, or have periods where they're not in a good space or not feeling well, and usually overeat around that time. And then it's cyclical in terms of there's a cycle where they eat a lot and a cycle where there isn't. In order for it to be classified as a disorder, it needs to happen uninterrupted for at least a period of 2 weeks, perhaps even to a month, where the person eats excessively all the time and does not have a sense of when they've had enough to eat. And that eating then will be followed by either actions of taking laxatives or inducing vomiting. And it needs to be something that's consistent and uninterrupted for quite a long space of time. But it definitely is on a spectrum that for people who are overweight, at times will speak about using food or certain kinds of food that are maybe high in fat or high in oil, in order to use it as a way of soothing emotions. But in order for it to be classified as an eating disorder, it needs to happen uninterrupted for a period of time, and then get in the way of the person's normal functioning, where the person has no sense of understanding that they've overindulged in something, and even when they know that they continue to eat because they have a plan in mind of either inducing vomiting or taking laxatives in order to rid themselves of this food. So there is this sense of feeling like, until a certain, if we talk about it psychologically, a certain emotion or certain state that they feel or find themselves in the moment is gone, then they don't stop eating. So it is that sense of getting to a very dangerous point of filling up your stomach, and then with a plan that you will purge or that you will induce vomiting in order to rid yourself of all the food that you've consumed.
Matome, how do we support people that have bulimia nutritionally? What does a plan in terms of nutritional support look like for them?
Look, the most important thing is from the psychologist. You can't do anything much if the underlying issues with multi-psychology are dealt with. But most of the time, it's to encourage them to eat your breakfast, lunch, and supper, so that they get to a point where they understand that you eat small amounts, so that you don't feel like you've eaten too much, and then you need to get rid of those things. But again, as long as you don't address the underlying issues of why they're doing what they're doing, regardless of what we say, most of the time, my experience is that you still get into problems when somebody, regardless of how much food you've prescribed them to eat, they'll still want to eat more.
Well, we continue our discussion and, of course, wrap it up as we go to an ad break. We're talking treatment, support, and rehabilitation for all these eating disorders when we come back from the ad break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vital Signs. Eating disorders treatment is determined by the types of disorders and, of course, the symptoms that you are experiencing. It typically includes a combination of psychological, counseling or psychotherapy, nutritional instruction, medical monitoring, and in some cases, medication. Now, the possibility for healing from an eating disorder increases the earlier the condition is identified and treatment is started. As a result, it is necessary to understand the typical warning signs of an eating condition. To talk to us more, and of course, we continue our discussion, we've got our clinical psychologist, Charity Mugone, and dietitian, Matome Diala. So, a lot of people speak to this idea of prevention is better than cure. So how do we prevent people finding themselves overeating or undereating?
I think it is about being able to understand where you are. So as a person, I think it's firstly starting with yourself in terms of just noting your relationship with food. And I mean, we all have a relationship with food, some more complex than other people, but it is about then seeing the different patterns. So when it starts where there's periods where you know that you often overeat or periods where you undereat, either because of stress or things that are happening in your life, to be able to flag those moments for yourself and then to introspect. And I think a lot of that can be difficult for people because we're always on the move and we always have things to do, and food is something that is essential, but also something that at times when you're talking about eating disorder can be something that's disordered. So it is about noticing the different patterns. And this is not to say that if you have times or periods where maybe you do find yourself overeating or find yourself undereating, perhaps because you're under stress or whatever it is, to immediately think that you have an eating disorder. But I think because of the impact that it has on your physical body and your physical functioning, it is something that you do need to see a doctor if there are periods where you're undereating especially, and periods where you're overeating. It is about having a conversation with yourself first and foremost, and to introspect about what you imagine is happening in your life. And still, if the behaviors continue and you have this sense of not being in control, particularly in the case of bulimia, where you feel like you have no control in terms of the amount of food that you eat and you cannot regulate it, and all you have is this guilt, I think it is important to, as soon as you notice it, speak to someone, because these disorders thrive in secrecy because of the shame that people feel, either from the restricting their food or the shame that they feel in the case of anorexia about their physical appearance of always feeling fat, or the guilt, I think the big guilt and shame over overeating in someone who is bulimic. It is very hard for people to come through and speak up about what is happening. And it's that secrecy that breeds the shame, and the secrecy that breeds the actual disorder, because then it thrives and lives a lot more in secrecy. But when you speak to someone and address that person, usually a professional, would be able to challenge some of the distortions that you have, either about your body or either about what is happening to you. And I think it is very important to see it as a disorder. This is something that people are struggling with. And the reason why people find it hard to find help or seek help as soon as possible is the shame that is that surrounds it, because people do think that food is such a simple thing. I mean, just eat. There's food, and you should be privileged that you have food, just eat. But I think it is important when someone speaks to you about having a struggle, or if you notice that maybe a colleague or friend or schoolmate is either not eating or has started to lose weight quite excessively, to ask the underlying questions. So things like, what has been troubling you? What is it that you're not finding easy to do? What is causing stress for you in your life? And I can see it in the way in which you eat or the way in which you're losing weight, so that it takes away that stigma and takes away that shame, so that people are able to talk and access early enough the underlying issues to why it is that they use food and the way that they use it.
But from a dietitian's perspective, prevention is definitely better than cure. How do you set up someone in terms of them getting to a place where they've got a balanced diet that is neither over or under eating?
I think a simple thing starts from one understanding where their weight is relative to their height. And then again, understanding what the simple things we can eat on a day-to-day basis. I think let's not consider healthy eating as dieting. I think that's very important, that we need to now understand that healthy eating is not dieting. Understand you need to have breakfast, you need to have lunch, you need to have supper. I mean, you a simple breakfast, either you have cereal or bread, but, control portions. Lunch and supper also control portions. Also include a variety of food in your diet. But understand that, healthy eating is not dieting. It's literally how everyone on a daily basis is supposed to be eating.
What does a multidisciplinary team look like for people that have under and overeating disorders?
Okay. So you would have a medical doctor just to make sure that everything is okay for the person and rule out any underlying medical conditions that might be causing either the weight loss. Then you would have a dietitian on the team as well. And at different points, perhaps an occupational therapist if the person's activities of daily living have been affected or something with their work or their occupation. And of course, a dietitian, which is quite important and vital to the whole team. So I think it's a chain of events, and usually disorders like eating disorders co-occur with things like depression or anxiety. And so the intervention of a psychiatrist and a psychologist come in trying to also rule out or treat the other underlying illnesses, psychiatric illnesses that might co-occur with the eating disorder. And then I think stabilizing the person physically and physiologically is what's most important in that case. And then being able to, in terms of a more prolonged and sustained treatment approach, to then have psychological intervention in the form of therapy and talking to a psychologist in order to address some of the underlying issues that have led to the eating disorder.
Now, Matome, what happens when things are not getting better? So you've sat down with the patients, you've come up with a scheme of the type of food that you think they should be eating, but you see that the results aren't coming the way that you want to. What sort of intervention should we look towards?
I mean, like I said, the major issue of eating disorders is literally underlying psychological issues. You probably still want to go back, as in terms of the team. Understand, is there anything that we are missing from the psychologist, from the doctor? What is that we are missing that we are not getting better? In case of somebody that is underweight, you probably in that time want to make sure that you probably add some supplements if that can help that patient to gain weight. Some high protein, high energy supplements to help that patient gain weight. In a case where somebody is overweight, how do we then restrict more of the food to make sure that the person gets a better weight? And in case of bulimia, you make sure that all the other things that could affect that patient are dealt with. Are we following the diet properly? What else can we add or delete from the diet to make sure that we are doing better in terms of the diet?
And lastly, Charity, in terms of family and friends and the type of support they could offer people that have eating disorders, what should family and friends do?
I think to be quite sensitive and see it as a struggle, that this person is struggling with something that is a psychiatric condition and something that does need treatment. So I think in most cases, people get quite angry, particularly where people restrict food, where there is food and someone refuses to eat to a point where it impacts on their health. The instinct, particularly if the parents involved, is to get quite annoyed and very irritated, but to understand that it is a condition and it is a psychiatric condition that needs treatment from a professional, and to treat it with that kind of seriousness, because willpower alone is not going to help the person. Be it bulimia, be it obesity, be it anorexia, it is a psychiatric condition which requires treatment, and it's not something that someone can snap out of. It's not something that someone can just do with willpower alone. So to be able to escalate, particularly when the person's physical health is now in danger, to escalate it to medical professionals, mental health professionals, because it's a condition.
Well, thank you so much, Charity. Thank you so much, Matome, for joining us today. And thank you to you at home for listening and watching as we took and tackled eating disorders on Vital Signs today. We'll continue our discussions. And of course, next week we'll be having another discussion. So please do join us. Enjoy the rest of your day from the Vital Signs team.